Hey everybody, welcome to this episode of the podcast. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about how to create clarity and confidence in your pricing and trying not to confuse your customers. And we've got with us today Chris Mele, who's going to kind of have some advice and information around this. So Chris, maybe start off with a bit of an introduction of yourself.
Well, thanks for having me, Tim. I didn't always run software pricing partners. I was actually a former customer in '08, and we were moving from on-prem to the cloud and terribly confused at the time. And so that was my entree, having spent millions on product, to realize when a board member said, well, how much did you spend on kind of the science of how to extract revenue from the product that we've all invested so much money in? And I had to have a little bit of an awkward answer, which was I didn't have an answer, reached out, found software pricing partners, and one thing led to another. When I exited that, I ended up here, and that was 15 years ago. And so I spend my day job dealing with executives that are in high-performing companies trying to get clarity and transparency around their pricing, and it's often very complicated in the world that they've created and lived in.
Awesome. So maybe that's a good place to start, right? Why is it so tough to try to create some good clarity in your pricing, and what are the challenges behind that?
Well, I think if you were to maybe look a little bit on the evolution of the software company, at least in my case, it was bootstrapped. We would spend all of our time and energy on product. The focus back then was on product market fit. And arguably, I don't think what we call product market profitability fit really kind of settled in until the late 2022. Back when everybody was growing, it didn't really matter if you were losing money or not as profitable. Like growth, that's all there was. In fact, I would tell you, even when I was on the phone with folks that needed help with their pricing, if they were growing like mad, like you weren't getting in on that deal. You just couldn't get their attention. The risk of upsetting the boat, I think, outweighed the potential gains that you could get. Pricing, believe it or not, is a pretty new thing from a discipline perspective. Most software companies have not ever gone through a formal pricing engagement. If they have, you can count them on one hand, maybe on two fingers. And it is not a skill inside the organization. In fact, there is no very rarely do we see pricing teams except in larger organizations. And even then, when you see a pricing team, it's like one guy in a food truck. It's just like he's being asked to do everything. And ultimately that devolves down into a bit of a deal desk-like role rather than a traditional pricing role. I think that's one of the frustrations with pricing professionals. Things have gotten very complicated on the innovation front. We have a lot more products, a lot broader portfolios. As we learned throughout the years, you and I might have said, hey, we have this older software, we'll start on a user basis. Then you and I smartened up and said, well, we have this second component, so why don't we do some usage-based example? And everybody else had a flavor of that. So if you imagined in a multi-product like play, we might have, and many of our customers do have, 12, 15 different ways in which they license the technology. And that creates all sorts of challenges and problems as customers try to buy multiple products and take those down. So there's an inventory of a bit of a mess, I think, for customers, software companies who've been out there for a while. And there's a real, like we were talking about earlier, term confusion already prior to AI's chunking process and merging everything together in the ongoing hallucinations. It was a hard thing to have a dialogue about pricing where you and I would be talking the same language, even though we're using the same term. And we can give lots of examples of that later in the podcast. But now that we've got the munging process of the chat GPTs and the Anthropics and all that, kind of putting all this stuff together, things are getting really weird on the conversation front. And I would tell you, we spent a lot of time sort of grounding everybody on a bit of a semantic or a lexicon or a bit of a playbook of how we can talk about this stuff without, confusing the hell out of each other. And welcome, little cat.
Yeah, the cat decided to join us here again. But I guess on cat, copycatting, right? I guess really what happens is with lack of a real formal practice around pricing and going through the exercises, like you mentioned, there's a lot of, well, I kind of look like company X, or company Y is growing at all costs with the pricing that looks like this, and that's what was popular, and just kind of copycat and bringing that to their business. And I'm just curious on what your observations have been around people trying to go that route versus a formal pricing exercise, and kind of where the pitfalls there.
So I did a talk at the Business of Software conference a few months ago, and I was being interviewed by a gentleman who sold his business to the London Stock Exchange. His name was Bill Sprawl. And Bill had asked me, and actually we'd asked the audience, if you had a new AI-like capability and you were pricing it in a certain way, sit down if you were charging by user, sit down if you were, and just kind of walking through like, well, how did you get to that? And then when he finished the talk track, like 80% of the crowd is still standing. And we kind of did like a double take, like, well, wait a minute, how did you come up with your price? And they said, well, we just copied the competitor. And then Bill said, well, if you copy the competitor, sit down. Like the whole room went whoop, and sat down, and we just kind of had a bit of a laugh about that. But I actually think that there's a reasonable explanation for this. So if you imagine as an engineer, it's all about reuse, and can I build a component, and can I take this widget and build a widget factory and borrow from that and put these things together, and you're trying to get that leverage. So I think it's actually natural to and pretty common to look outside and then take what somebody else is doing that you perceive for some reason is better, and to then pull that inside. It's a bit like reusing a Lego kit, I think, is kind of the engineering-like focus. And I have a computer science degree, and that's frankly what I did at my software company. I just looked out at what other people were doing, and I glommed on a bunch of stuff, and things got really weird as we grew, and then we kind of had to hire software pricing partners to ungum what I had kind of the pricing was super accurate, Tim. It just was a little incomprehensible, I think, to our customers and our salespeople. But I digress. So when you borrow from the outside in, two things happen. First is you copy unknowingly their blueprint of risk. And the problem with that is you don't know what the blueprint looks like. And I can tell you, being in those organizations, especially the ones that are perceived as probably more successful than the others, there are lots of things that need to change, lots of problems, lots of inefficiencies. And so then you see this kind of propagation. And actually there's a classic example with charging by the number of contacts in the CRM space. I mean, that was made up early on, copied everywhere, and it's a really challenging metric for customers to get a hold of, because if I generate 1,000 leads or contacts over in Dubai, and I don't have an office in Dubai, and I don't do business in Dubai, like those leads are worth nothing to me, right? So I don't really want to pay for them. So, and the second problem that happens after we unknowingly copy the blueprint of risk is we have therefore robbed ourselves of the internal exercise of expressing, enumerating, listing out our value, having an internal perspective on our value. And when we don't have an internal perspective on our value, we can't equip the sales force and the partner channels and the other distribution channels with how to defend that price, because we haven't really done our homework, because we borrowed from the outside in. And so then all of a sudden you got to borrow their playbook, their sales material, their other stuff. And there's lots of examples of corporate espionage gone wrong, et cetera. So I think it is great to do outside in, but it has to be balanced with and weighted much heavier towards inside out. And that means we need a process, we need some tools, we need some supporting technology, and we need some people dedicated to that function.
Yeah, and I think it comes back to, right, to the definition. Like you're talking about that blueprint of risk, like there's a difference in your risk on whether you're doing tokens, whether you're doing credits, whether you're doing seats, whether you're doing number of contacts, whether you're doing pure usage of how you're using the system, right? And definitions matter. And maybe you can talk a little bit about more, we hinted on it earlier, around, what are the real differences? What are the risks that come behind some of those different ones, specifically on the way that they're defined?
Well, let's take an example. This one actually just happened last week on our team. Carrie is a former CMO, worked at Microsoft, and we were, trying to tear through the sea of new terms that have come out, and we do that periodically. We take the new terms, we map them into our framework, and make sure that we understand. And it's sometimes puzzling to figure out what is being talked about. But I'll give you a basic example. Somebody talked about tiered pricing. In our frameworks and lexicon, tiered pricing describes volume pricing, and you typically would see tiers where I would tell you the first 25 units are full price, units 26 through 50 are a different, and there's a stair step, and some calculated as a tax table and others calculated as an all-in price. And there's a whole world of terms that we would be thinking about and discussing under this umbrella term called tiered pricing. But you'd be amazed how many times you can go out and read on the web about tiered pricing, and what they're talking about is a good, better, best. That's actually tiered packaging. But yet, imagine if two executives were in the room and we were talking back and forth about tiered pricing, not talking about in the weeds, but more strategically. Like, it might be, and I can tell you it was about 28 minutes when I sat in a recent executive meeting where somebody realized, oh shit, like, you're talking about that. Oh, I was talking about this. And that's like one of hundreds of definitions that are cropping up over the years. And there was a wonderful talk also on the Business of Software conference by a gentleman named Bill Aulette. And he said, and I loved this, this was 2012, I think, 2013. And he said, the problem in the software industry is we keep inventing new terms for the same thing. And his example was a pivot. He's like, it's not a pivot, it's a change in business strategy. But every time we layer in another set of terms, we rob ourselves again of the ability to share lessons learned and to build this repository that everybody can leverage. And what I'm seeing is a real, especially with the AI and the content generation, just a real propagation of a lot of messy terms that are making it even more difficult now than ever before to just have an open dialogue around pricing. And then secondly, like, what would we do to maybe correct or make our pricing simpler or more transparent? And we've got hundreds of examples of these. It's a really, I think it's a growing problem.
And we see it reflect across verticals as well, right? Like, someone will call something a package and a bundle, and it depends on if you're in the telecom industry, then they've got a specific verbiage that they're using for the same sort of thing. And so when you're selling your software across multiple industries, it becomes a challenge there as well. And I'm just curious on, like, how there's acquiring the customer to begin with, right? And then there's the long-term customer experience and how you're doing upsells and cross-sells and these different things. And I'm just curious on, how that clarity around how you're structuring the pricing affects your customer experience right from purchasing experience to long-term.
Well, it will affect that, and it will affect the salesperson's motion. So let's talk about I think this is just a great sort of segue to, there's three major problems you have to solve if you're going to create a pricing strategy. The first one is, what are you going to put in the quantity field? So we use terms like usage-based, consumption-based. These are now synonyms, even though for our last, I think consumption was more tied to hardware and usage was more tied to application, but everything's kind of munging together now. That defines the range of quantities that you'll see on the sales floor. And if the range of quantities are too large, the buyer's experience, they're going to have a hard time estimating. And if they have a hard time estimating tokens, for example, then what they're going to do is they're not going to want to buy because they're not sure if they bought enough. So they're going to want to do a paid pilot. Actually, they're probably going to do a free pilot, and you're going to push for a paid pilot. So right away, like, the customer experience is different. Plus, like, your selling motion just got impacted, and you may not have even realized that decision led down that road. And so that's a big topic to just discuss with its own terms and things to work through. Then you get into packaging, which has terms like, interestingly enough, you brought up a bundle. Well, there's bundling, which more generically is used synonymously with packaging. But then there's a bundle, which is a combination of two things that are typically bought together, whose sum of the list prices, in a lot of cases, is the bundle price is less because it has a built-in incentive or discount to get you to take down the bundle so that we get this cross-selling motion. Okay, so in packaging though, how you express, whether it's modular, platform, is AI going to be sold as an add-on? Do we meld it over into the main application? And if so, what happens if somebody uses too much of this and we get hurt on cost? That packaging can also be its own animal that you have to wrestle to the ground. And many of our customers have what we call skew sprawl. So some of our customers have 40, 50,000 SKUs. It's mind-boggling across 20 different currencies. I mean, the price points are in the hundreds of thousands. It's really hard problem to get through. After you get past the second bridge of packaging, which by the way, if done correctly, makes it super easy for the buyer to come on in and get what they want. If done incorrectly, then you and I show up and say, well, I love package B, but like, I don't want 20% of this crap. So can I please have a discount? Because I'm never going to use this stuff. And that's a huge problem also. Then after you cross those two bridges, licensing and then packaging, then we get into this idea of pricing. What is the right price point? What is the right price structure? Are we going to treat things like nonprofits and education facilities uniquely because they don't have the same ability to pay, let alone different willingness to pay? Those are two different concepts. And then we get into sales promotions and all these things that happen where the customer just wants to understand, can you please tell me my net price, Tim? Like, I just want to know. And then after we spend a rodeo and I still can't figure out the net price, I'm like, but I want to take two things out, put this other thing in. And I just want like 2 or 3 different choices here. And you'd be amazed how many times this is done in Excel with software companies. Salespeople have libraries of all these models and things to do. And how often this simple request by a buyer turns into a week or more of the salesperson coming back and giving them an answer. And I think that in and of itself is hugely problematic for buyers, especially right now where software companies, the ones that are best of breed, we're having a dialogue like on the phone. I'm able to manipulate price with you on the phone. I'm giving you a sea of choices. Yeah, between 50 grand and 125 grand. If you choose this module, it looks like this. This is how discounts are earned. This is your per unit price. If we go and skip over the pilot, I can take the $100 per unit all the way down to $2.50. Our pricing's built to scale. Let me show you how that works. If you're not having that talk track and it's sort of the other stuff, sort of the older style stuff, I think you've got some soul searching to do right now.
Yeah, and we see that skew sprawl as well in the deal. At the end of the day, it's like, how much I'm going to pay, what am I paying for, and is it in my budget, right? Because they're just on the other end of that conversation going, okay, you sent over a quote sheet that's got 17 SKUs with a $0 price on them, but they're still on my quote sheet, and why are they there? And I think, one of the things that we see, especially in the enterprise deal space, is the salespeople want to have the flexibility to be able to win the deal. Everybody wants to feel as though they're getting a good deal. Hey, those are 20 things that I don't want. I shouldn't have to pay for those because I'm not going to use those, even though they're part of the package. So what is the right balance then between providing your salespeople the right flexibility to be able to get the deal done, but then not infinite flexibility that turns into this full indecision that I don't even know if I can say yes or no to what you're proposing?
Well, so this hits right in the center of packaging. So I think that the mistake, so remember, as software company engineers and sort of this reuse, we also like to reuse frameworks in other areas. So remember, pricing isn't really a discipline that we stand up inside the software. It's very rare to see pricing treated. In fact, the one that comes to mind is Mythic Quest, who has like a formal chief monetization officer. That's the only one. And Mythic Quest is like a Silicon Valley like show, but they actually have a CMZO, a chief monetization officer, and it's hysterical. But we don't have that in our industry, and so because we don't have that stood up as a discipline, we tend to then borrow a framework that we use for monetization, which I believe is inappropriate. And the inappropriate framework is when we do segmentation. So when I'm in marketing, if you and I were in the marketing team, segmentation is, don't get me wrong, it's very important. I need to know who's in the buying process and I don't know why Betty's always in purchasing, but she's always in purchasing, and Dan is always in scheduling. And you understand all this stuff because you have a lead gen engine, and I need to feed you very specific content because in this case, Betty and Dan want to read different things. And that's great for lead gen and the marketing stack. When we bring that over into monetization, we end up with really complicated packaging. And you can see examples of this all day long. If you go to some of the big dogs, you'll see like every feature is metered. Like I think on HubSpot, the latest count was like 26 different things are counting, from active lists to number of contacts to like you name it, everything's metered. When we go down that road, what we're doing in a sense is we're focusing more on the differences rather than the commonalities. And there's always a reason why somebody's different. And this creates the skew sprawl. This creates pricing schedules unique to industry verticals. And when we step back and look at the differences, they're really not all that different, but they are transacted in the sales op and the billing systems differently under different skew structures, et cetera. When we have a monetization lens on, we want to focus more on the commonalities, not on the different. The differences are still important, but the commonalities is really what unites people together. And those commonalities, once discovered, form very concrete boundaries between a small, finite number of groups. You can call them customer groups. Think of them as many customer segments could fit in a customer group. Many different two customers in the same SIC and industry vertical could be in two different groups. And you're kind of looking at how they use the software, how they derive value, what they value. And in those commonalities, you can tease out some really universal truths that bring a method to the madness and settle this differentiation game down. Instead of seeing 1,000 Lego pieces on the table, we see like 5. And those 5 form the basis, let's say, of some pretty major packages. And then you'll start to see like there's some adjuncts that are only, if you're service line driven, well, maybe then you're not going to be interested in this feature over here because it doesn't relate to your service line. Or if you're in some other pattern, you might be interested in certain features, and those could, form the basis of these add-ons. But this is the inside out exercise that software companies don't typically do. The thing that they have are product marketing slicks that dozens of them, right? Where they're all talking at different layers of value and benefits and features and capabilities. It's all like kind of commingled together, but pulling that out into a repository, being able to process it, being able to have customers weigh in on what they think about, we call them value drivers, what is valuable, what isn't. That turns out to be a really important exercise in the simplification part of the journey. Having just gone through this with a client last week, I can tell you it's very painful. It's sort of like painting all the walls. You finish one and you're like, oh yeah, this looks great. And then you're like, shit, like I've got like 17 more of these to do. And you got to pace yourself, but you do have to tear into the products and tear into them. Marketing calls these the majors and the minors, and really start to ask questions and build this together. And I think that as long as we overweight the outside in perspective, again, we're not doing this homework assignment, and the end result is a lot of complexity in packaging, and therefore a lot of complexity in pricing.
Yeah, and like so, I like your analogy of the 1,000 Lego pieces, right? Like, do you think some of the cost of that is going back to some of the things you commented about being kind of engineering driven, right? Because like some of those things and why they probably have prices on them is that there's underlying infrastructure, and there's an infrastructure cost behind each one of those things. And the obvious thing from an engineer, I'm a computer science grad myself as well. Well, this is our infrastructure, and we don't know how much of it's going to be used by the customer, so we need to put a margin on each of these things and put that in the pricing to make sure that we're covering ourselves and our infrastructure costs. But you're surfacing all of those details up to your customer to make a decision on them not knowing that. And then I'm curious on what your views are on how do you deal with variable infrastructure costs when you're trying to get these packages into a point, because there's always that fear that I'm going to run over if I charge you too little, if I'm not doing it on like an X plus, percent markup on these things. I'm curious on what you've been finding works out there.
Well, I think there's 2 parts here. I think the first part has to do with anything that carries with it even a third party cost. And if the organization is launching a product at a time where they don't fully understand what those costs look like, there is a heavy tendency to pass that capability through as an add-on with its own pricing model, which really is the cost model and how you're being charged. And so now I'm charging you by users, but I'm also charging you by storage. And I'm also charging you by tokens, because that's a pretty common AI thing. And I'm also charging all. And we know that you have to be very careful with add-ons because we have the attachment rate problem. The attachment rate typically goes with implementation in software. And if implementation is optional, or if training is optional, anytime something is optional, you have to really pay attention to how often it's being attached and bought basically along with the main, let's say, driver product. When we take something that we don't truly understand the cost and we sort of punt it down the field, and we glom that vendor's pricing model or infrastructure model onto our pricing, and we say, here you go, Tim, like, go ahead and buy your Amazon QuickSite licenses separately, but we'll go ahead and charge. It creates a lot of confusion, but worse yet, some customers also will tag a margin on top. And then of course, now they're in a pickle, because similar to a postage stamp, everybody can go look online what a postage stamp is. And I'm going to ask you, like, why are you embedding an extra 5 cents on the postage stamp? That whole phenomenon also created complexity. So the reason or what really needs to happen is that the organization needs to get a perspective on their cost, using things like fair use policies and other things, using the packaging levers where we don't always couch something as an add-on. Otherwise, every new thing on the roadmap is an add-on. And you'll know that you've gone too far when customers are like, I just feel like I'm nickel and dimed here. Like, that just is add-on hell. And you've gone way down the road there. You got to bring some of that stuff back. So if we talk about AI for just a moment, while you can price AI separately, we have a secondary problem, which is an accuracy problem inside of AI, where it's pretty common knowledge that thing kind of does some wacky stuff. And if you played with it long enough, like, you've definitely seen some wacky stuff. So all of a sudden, if I'm using AI to summarize a bunch of notes or to do something and it goes a little awry, like, I'm not going to maybe be super excited about paying for that. And now if you cast that to me as an add-on, like, I'm probably maybe not going to take it on right away. So then we have a double whammy, right? Because the organization doesn't know its token usage. If they're running agents, it gets even worse, because that really obscures things. And we're not getting the usage data from the customers, because it's a poor attachment rate as an add-on. And now, like, we're not learning, we don't have any information, we have really crappy usability, and they're not coming online fast enough, right? Now, that's not every case. I mean, some customers, everybody's taking in the AI, but you have to look at, I think, the broader goal of what you're trying to do. If you're early on and you're trying to get that usage data, you probably want to meld that in. If you already have the usage data, you understand what that looks like, then, maybe you can play with it separately. And you have to pay attention. Is it really, if I sell you an add-on, it's going to be really hard if this add-on really takes off and it's as revolutionary as this AI stuff is making me. An add-on can't really be more expensive than the core. I mean, I can't go to you and say, I know you spent $500,000 on the core, but like, it's $2 million for the add-on. Like that, I mean, you can, it's just kind of like a slog on the sales front. So you really have to be careful about how you cast things. And I think how you protect yourself is, just like in monetization, your job is not to monetize the customer and maximize the money in that transaction. Your job is to monetize the portfolio. And so your job is to have an opinion early on that you're going to revise and you're going to iterate on pretty darn quickly on, well, what is appropriate use? How much does everybody need? What's that 80-20 kind of balance? And let me wrap that into some fair usage policies. And now we're hitting square into pricing as a process. So if we're on a period of time, or in a period of time where innovation is very high, which I believe we are, things are happening very quickly. New models are coming out, new cost structures, all that stuff. It has the potential to literally change overnight. I think you're really stuck if the best you can do is update your pricing for the SKO coming up in sales kickoff coming up in January. If you're going to need to turn this model, and so if you're playing with AI and some of these usage components, and like you got to keep turning that model, because your roadmap's coming out with new stuff, you're delivering new value, all this stuff is changing, and this, of course, just sets the stage for, I think, he or she who iterates faster and turns the wheel faster wins. If I was a startup or a fast-growing company going up against an incumbent, and I knew at best they could get pricing out on their January kickoff, I would rule the roost. I'd be turning my pricing at least quarterly, and then by the time they figure out their sales kickoff, I'm 3 steps ahead, right? And I think you got to start really thinking about, even if you don't know how to price and bring transparency, you got to start thinking about, how do I equip myself to roll this stuff out faster? How do I equip myself to update my playbooks, update my price book, update my list prices, update my net prices, my packaging? How do I turn this thing faster? It really is glued in right now.
Well, and I think, and part of that, right, is making sure that you're not putting the burden on your customer to figure out what that price is going to be. Like, if you've got that usage, you've got your tokens, and you mentioned it, right? Maybe you put together a fair usage terms, you do something in there so that they feel good and not taking on that burden going, I just don't know what I'm going to pay.
And there's a great corollary that, and I don't remember where I heard this, but it was like, imagine that you and I and 3 other guys are in a group, and we're like, hey, where do you want to go to dinner? And we're all like, well, I don't know, it's wherever you want to go. And it's called passing the cognitive buck. And then around the table it goes, as we all waste time and energy. And eventually what they say is, it's way better for me to say, like, well, I hate Mexican and I don't want to eat anything other than, I'll eat anything but that. And for you to say, well, I really like Italian, like, we just zero in right away. I think when everything's cast as an add-on, or we just borrow from the component that we embedded, and we take their pricing model and just like pass it through to the customer, it's exactly that. You're just passing the cognitive buck, because now that customer has to figure out, well, how much of that third-party component, how many tokens am I going to need? And now what you've really done is you've just given your salespeople like twice the problem, because now I can't just estimate users, I have to estimate users and tokens, and then users and tokens and storage. I mean, this is what propagates salespeople to ask for more SKUs, and it also creates these shadow libraries. Some salespeople have like a dozen spreadsheets that are just like in their little library back here, and they rip them out for just the right case so they can get the presentation layer right to their customer, because they can't get it out of Salesforce, and all these other games that they play. But what's happening is, all that sprawl isn't just SKU sprawl, it's just sprawl everywhere. Like, it just literally pours molasses into the work processes inside of the software company, and everything starts to get mired, and sales cycles slow down, and we take a week to get a quote back, and then I got to go get approval for, like, all this stuff just grinds things to a halt.
So what would you, when you go in, so I'm assuming your consulting has changed and evolved over the last few years, and I'm curious on how has that evolved, and how, what are the practical steps that you're starting to work with your clients with to really kind of wrap their arms around their pricing?
Well, we've covered one, which is term confusion. So we do have to ground on a common, we do spend time getting them up to speed on a common language so that we can actually communicate with them effectively, right? So there's quite a bit of learning, I think, that happens there. And it's a lot of unwinding of other terms that get sort of overlaid onto something that is much clearer and simpler to understand. I think when I arrived here, so when I went through my pricing project with Software Pricing Partners, it was 2008. It's largely spreadsheet driven. It was, to me, I don't know how many hours went into the spreadsheet, but I mean, it was crazy. Like, it was, I'm pretty sure it went to like I think I think the columns went out to like the two, I think it was like FG. I think it went like it went on forever. And it was like 2 times new, and it was very sophisticated, but it was largely incomprehensible, right? Since then, we've built a lot of technology so that we don't have to do spreadsheets and modeling software and things that we spend a lot of time on the presentation layer of getting you to be able to digest this. But the way in which things were attacked on the consulting front is largely PowerPoint and Excel and bodies and time and materials like constructs. So when I got here in 2013, I mean, you could see the writing on the wall back then. I was like, this all needs to change. We're going to drive all that cost out of the model. We're going to build tools, software, et cetera. And that's where our level setter software came from. When you process this stuff, nobody wants to sit in a room. Let's say in the old days, you and I would be a consultant guiding a software company on, do you want to do users versus usage-based? And under usage-based, you have 6 choices. You can charge based on, this metric or that metric or that metric. What would happen is somebody would have to go build all these models, or we would just qualitatively put our feet up, maybe, grab a martini, do a little bit of a shot, and then make our list, our short list, qualitatively eliminate some of them, and then sort of narrow in, and then we go task the teams. You and I would go play golf, and they'd go like Excel help, building all this stuff, trying to figure out if it worked. I think that ship has sailed. So the way that we work is very much sitting in the room, and if we had 6 metrics, we would just flop them in and out and level set or show you the revenue product. Like we would have a dynamic in the moment discussion. If you said, well, I want to start discounting at $25,000, not $20,000, we would be like, okay, well, just click a button. Oh, that's a $12 million decision. Are you sure you want to do that? Here's the accounts that are going to be impacted. You have to be able to process, I think, at that rate in today's executive teams, because if not, this project's going to take like 2 years. And by the time you come back a week later on the old traditional consulting model, you're going to kind of be like out of date and have to go get caught up because maybe there's a new model out with new token-based pricing or new cost implications or some other innovation that we're going to be dealing with. So to me, I think what is ultimately happening is we're starting to see the renewed focus on profitability. We're starting to see the emergence of pricing as a discipline. And we're starting to see customers demanding tools and expertise where they no longer want to be told what to do. They want to be shown the recommendation and the rationale behind and the option to come in and say, well, I know you set the prices here and we're at an 8% upside. If we go ahead and roll this out to new business next year in North America and Europe, I kind of like to see what a 9.5% upside model looks like. And I think that's where we start to really see engagements and executive teams more confidently roll out their pricing rather than in the old days, you digest a 200-page PowerPoint slide, and as soon as you hit the sales ops and the recommendation doesn't match and you can't pull that off, or it hits product and your engineers come back and go, well, I know you want to separate the thing that way, but our licensing system doesn't kind of work and we can't do that. Then like that doesn't work. And then somebody changes that recommendation and doesn't realize it ripples back into all the other decisions that were made, and we start to have these really messy rollouts and some egg on people's faces. So anyway, I think it's been a big transformation, and arguably one that I'm really excited about, because I think when I came here in 2014, the firm really struggled with trying to convince people that, that this is a missing business process inside of the software business model. It should be treated with not just professionalism, but it should be treated with the rigor and the science and the tools that support it. And it's been a long time in the making.
Yeah, well, so it's interesting, the transition, right, from PowerPoints and Excel into software. And I'm curious on, we've talked about AI a few different times here. I'm curious on, are you seeing the next steps of AI helping out in that technology aspect of things? So you're producing software to be able to help generate and assist in these decisions, calculate the models. Are you starting to see some AI start to creep its way, find its way into some of those technologies that you're using with clients?
Well, so under the AI umbrella is also ML, machine learning. So let's be careful. Then there's the Gen AI token stuff. We have not wrapped Gen AI. We can, accuracy is absolutely paramount. So I can't throw a data set to a Gen A. I mean, I could, but then you've got to be double, triple checking that. And so we've already built those systems and we've already built
How
those
did it
models.
come up with that model? I don't know. It's
Yeah, and that
probably just
explainability, right?
decided in, right?
So I don't think that's ready for in pricing. I don't think that's ready for prime time. The other problem is, and the reason for this is that much of what you do in pricing after you get the data cleaned up and the inputs kind of structured and you've got your information, including competitive insights and market research or anything else you're doing, there is a weighing of the tea leaves, a reading of the tea leaves to bring in the expert judgment. And what I mean by that is, we borrow from patterns and value delivery. We have a really large knowledge base over the years of all these engagements back from 1982. So patterns of value delivery are not industry specific. They'll overlay across many industries. So if we see a business problem, the client might be speaking, oh, we need a good, better, best, but we know based on the pattern, like we should not show up to the party to force fit this model. Let's see what is expressed and how that matches to some value delivery pattern. And I think that is a better way of thinking through the problem of how to best express somebody's licensing, packaging, and pricing. So I think that what we will ultimately see, and I think I wrote a piece about this maybe, oh God, it was maybe 4 or 5 years ago, Tim, and I have yet to see it. But I do wonder if we will see a chief monetization officer, like in the Mythic Quest kind of thing. I think what is happening is it needs a clear owner. It needs somebody who can bridge between product and the sales ops and the sales teams and I think that in what I'm noticing is when you try to overlay it on top of product marketing or product or other things, it's like it doesn't quite overlay because everybody has their own racy diagram of what they're going to be up against, and now they kind of glom pricing on top. So I think it's going to I think pricing is going to kind of elbow its way in and carve out its own little niche over the next 5 years to where it is really a stand-up kind of discipline. Do you remember what we used to see in product management? Like beforehand, you build it and they would come and that's just kind of the way it worked. And then all of a sudden we had these things called product managers and we started learning about Agile and all this. I think you're starting, I see a lot of the similar seeds being planted right now.
You got it. So, I mean, tons of insights, Chris. Fantastic content. I'm just curious if you have any closing thoughts around, just overall bringing clarity to your pricing before we end up today.
Well, I'm not sure this will be anything different, Tim, but I guess my challenge to any real software exec or leader is to think about pricing as a process and not an activity, that they need to get better at capitalizing on these pivotal moments, these inflection points, whether it's I'm launching a new capability like AI or something else, whether it's market expansion, acquisition, competitive threats. If it's a process, right? These moments crop up all the time. They don't just hit at the end of the year all at once, right? Mm-hmm. But if it's a natural course of business, then you're going to be more nimble. You're going to be less, I think, freaked out and having lots of consternation about making changes. And it's a bit like when our architecture, I think it's 10 years old, then you kind of have to refresh it. I feel like everybody's pricing architecture is kind of really old unless they're brand new to the party and they get to kind of start fresh, but it's kind of time to get in there. But I think that still people think about it as an event, and that this magic event that we're going to do, boil the ocean kind of approach. We're going to ingest all this competitive intelligence. We're going to look at all this value. We're going to do all this market research, and out crops this magic answer that's going to last for 3 years. Is totally not going to work. And so, if you were to boil down our mission, it's just basically to get customers to the point where the revenue and the ongoing capabilities that they're delivering off that roadmap are on par with the value that's being delivered, which just reeks of a process. And I just think if you sat down as an executive and just thought through that, you would realize treating this stuff as an event where I go hire a consulting team and they give me this big answer and I tell the board, hey, we're off to the like that I really do think that ship has sailed. People will still do
really,
it. I just think the ship has sailed.
It's got to be part of the, like you said, it's the same sort of thing, like that transition you saw to product managers and ad. Like it's everything is running through finding the value, being able to communicate it. How is it going to go back out to the customer? Like I think that it just needs to be a continuous iterative process that's going on with the business.
Yeah, and you gave me kind of another thought here too, Tim, which is maybe if you thought of it this way, even if you're web first, we used to have software on-prem and we used to deliver a new edition every year. And some people may not realize this, but we used to charge you for it. Isn't that crazy? So for the companies that still have the older style stuff, when they moved to the cloud, everything went into the subscription stream, including all the new stuff that you potentially would have charged separately for. So put another way, even if you're web first now, monetization really is a wedge into your stream of value coming off that roadmap that you're using to make the product better. You're just putting a wedge in there and just asking yourself the question, like, what's new product that I didn't promise before versus what is care and feeding, maintenance, and sort of the break fix kind of stuff that I would do as part of the subscription stream. And if I then insert that wedge, then what we're really just talking about is how do I maintain that separation and constantly like monetize the sliver, or maybe it's bigger than a sliver of value coming off the roadmap of stuff that I never knew I was going to create back when I sold those customers last year. And again, if you think through that, you devolve it right back to it's a process. So anyway, that's my hope, and I think it will be very painful for those that don't think of it that way in the coming years. I think it's just changing so quickly now. The rate of change is off the charts.
Yeah. So again, thanks, Chris. I mean, lots of great insights today. I really like to, and thank you again for joining us and sharing your insights of what you're finding out there with the customers that you're talking to. Again, just thanks for joining.